"Look at Peter," Johnson said. "This isn't a cockfight here. This is serious, and Henry is a serious guy. You guys have got to get together, and you've got to test how serious he is." A meeting between Cohen and Kravis was set for Tuesday morning. Jim Robinson's alarm grew as he read a copy of Johnson's management agreement for the first time Monday afternoon. It was worse than he had feared. The veto, the free ride, the incredible total all bothered him. But what worried the chairman of American Express most was what Wall Streeters called the cosmetics of the deal. From a public point of view, and Robinson had no doubt the document would ultimately be disclosed, the agreement simply looked awful. In a reporter's hands, it would be turned into a document of greed incarnate. To Robinson, the prospect of 7 men's sharing up to $2 billion was a public relations disaster waiting to happen. Changes would have to be made, he could see, and not just for the sake of cosmetics. The pact was simply too rich. Much of the money promised to Johnson would now have to be channeled into a bid high enough to beat Kravis. As his closest friend on Wall Street, Jim Robinson was the natural choice to carry the difficult message to Johnson. On Monday night, Robinson sat down in Johnson's office and tried to break the news as gently as possible. "Ross," he said in his Atlanta lilt, "we've got to reappraise things in a way that is more appropriate, given what's going on." "What do you mean?" Johnson asked, bridling a little. He remembered Steve Goldstone's cautionary words about the management agreement. "These guys are going to try and screw you down and down and down." Johnson trusted Jim Robinson, to a point. "I hope you're not here as the advocate of Peter Cohen," Johnson said, "because they're not going to take us down and just give it all back to Shearson." "No, Ross, this is how I feel. I'm here as a friend." Totally different, Johnson said. "What do you want to do?" "How many people are going to share in the management agreement?" Robinson asked. "It could be 8, it could be 20, Johnson said. He said he hadn't given the matter much thought. "I thought maybe you might want to better define what it is," Robinson suggested. "I don't give a goddamn," Johnson said. "I've always thought that a lot of employees would share it. I want to get it to as broad a group as possible." Robinson explained that it might be a good idea to set that idea in motion. Maybe the best thing to do would be to get Davis Polk and Champ Mitchell's law firm working on an employee stock ownership plan. Johnson agreed. Later, he would say that it had been his intention all along. Whether or not employees would actually share in Johnson's riches, of course, was beside the point. What mattered here was cosmetics. Jim Robinson couldn't throw out the management agreement, but he could make damn sure that, once revealed to directors and a skeptical public, it would be easier to swallow. He hoped. "Offers for RJR pit KKR and Shearson in a battle for turf," read the front-page headline in the Wall Street Journal on Tuesday morning. Kravis read the article with disgust. Both major papers, the Journal and the New York Times, reported his Friday meeting with Cohen in detail. Both, Kravis thought, made him out to be the heavy, the overlord of LBOs attempting to smite an upstart competitor. He was especially irked at quotes attributed to him about protecting his franchise, a word Kravis would later deny having uttered. Whatever the truth, it was apparent to Kravis that Shearson was using the press to strike at his Achilles heel, his public image. Kravis had to laugh, though, when he read Cohen's remarks to the Journal. Playing the wounded innocent, Cohen complained that Kravis was muscling in on his deal after promising to meet with Shearson. "We ski together and socialize together," Cohen said of Kravis, "and I thought there was a higher level of conduct called for here." Kravis couldn't believe it. He didn't consider Cohen his friend. Why, he told friends, he hardly knew the man. They had skied together once at some Shearson ski boondoggle in Vail, and hardly socialized outside occasionally bumping into each other at Wall Street functions. The nerve of the guy. The atmosphere at Tuesday morning's breakfast between Cohen and Kravis was no worse than that inside any commercial meat locker. Cohen arrived first and surveyed the ground. They had chosen a neutral venue, the dining room at the Plaza Hotel. Cohen asked the maitre d' for an isolated table, one where he and Kravis could talk discreetly, and was led into an uncrowded corner of the dining area. Kravis walked in minutes later and took a seat across from Cohen. After ordering coffee, the two men got straight to business. "Henry, I said I was going to call you, and I would have called you," Cohen said. "I believe I'm a person who keeps his word. Now you've escalated this thing." If Cohen was combative, he was also a realist. A drawn-out battle with Kravis was one Shearson could well lose. He pitched a compromise. "We're open-minded about this, Henry. We never intended to keep all the equity in the transaction to ourselves. It's simply too big. We're looking for a sensible transaction. If we can do a sensible transaction that will help everyone's objectives, we ought to try. Now, why don't we try and do something together?" "Like what?" Kravis asked. "A split. 50-50. "That's not going to happen," Kravis said. Kohlberg-Kravis never did 50-50 deals. "That's too much." "I don't think it should be at anything other than 50-50, Cohen said. No. He wouldn't discuss it further. Kravis brought up the management agreement. He had been thinking about what Jeff Beck said a month before. They want control of the board. If Johnson didn't want the Kohlberg-Kravis kind of buyout, what kind did he want? "It's your normal deal," Cohen said. "Nothing special." "What's that mean?" Kravis asked. "Is that 5, 10, 15, 30%? What?" "Yeah, in that range." Cohen pointedly failed to mention Johnson's veto power or the $2 billion management agreement he had demanded and received. "If we do something," Cohen said, "we'll obviously make that all available to you." As they talked, Kravis attempted to size up Cohen. The man was out of his element, he decided. Kravis knew Cohen had attempted no more than 1 or 2 buyouts in his career. Eric Gleacher was calling him Peter Cohen, boy investment banker. Yet Cohen seemed to think he was dealing from strength. He's feeling pretty good, Kravis thought. He thinks he has all the cards because he has management. He thinks the presence of Ross Johnson will stop us. Well, boy investment banker, Kravis told himself, you're in for one hell of a surprise. What Cohen didn't know, Kravis recalled months later, was that we were charging right through the rice paddies, not stopping for anything and taking no prisoners. While Cohen and Kravis glared over their coffee cups, Johnson decided to take matters into his own hands. He simply had to know if the Kravis bid was real, and if so, what it meant for his management group. Johnson was nothing if not a quick read. He could tell Cohen was less than enthusiastic about sharing the deal of his life with Kravis. Both times Cohen and Kravis had spoken, they had gotten into spit fights. Maybe it made sense to try some kind of partnership with Kravis. The only way to find out for sure, he reasoned, was to meet with Kravis himself. Scanning his phone messages, Johnson saw Steve Waters' name. Perhaps the former Shearson investment banker, now working for Kravis, would be a good conduit. Minutes later, Waters picked up the phone in his office at Morgan Stanley and was surprised to hear Johnson's laughter. "I thought I'd get through to you," Johnson said, chuckling. "Ross," Waters bantered, "you know I always talk to you." Johnson mentioned he might have an interest in speaking with Kravis. "You really should see Henry," Waters said. "He's not such a bad guy. It clearly makes sense for you guys to be talking to each other." Johnson agreed. Next, he tracked down Jim Robinson at American Express. He wanted to touch base before striking out on his own. "Listen, Jim, I think I'm going to meet with Henry, just to hear what he has to say. What do you think?" Robinson listened as Johnson made his case. "I just think the more people talking, the better. Maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but I'd like to hear their position myself. Jim, you're a high road guy, and so am I. I think there's a high road here." He left the obvious unspoken. Cohen's low road arguments with Kravis were getting them nowhere. "Jimmy," he concluded, "I want to bring in the varsity team, not the JV." When Robinson agreed, Johnson got back to Steve Waters. A meeting with Kravis was set for 4 o'clock that afternoon. After his breakfast with Cohen, Kravis crossed the street and caucused with Beatty and Roberts, who had flown in the night before, in his 42nd floor office overlooking Central Park. Peter Cohen, they agreed, was the only thing standing in the way of their owning RJR Nabisco. There was no earthly reason for Shearson to be in this deal. Ross Johnson had the management expertise, Kohlberg Kravis had the buyout expertise. Cohen had an appetite for big fees, an eye on making it big in LBOs, and a bad attitude. "They don't bring much to the table," Roberts said. "No, they don't," Kravis agreed. There had to be a way to get rid of Shearson. The obvious solution was to offer it some lesser role in the deal. Kravis favored some kind of advisory fee and maybe a chance to buy a piece of the action. But he wasn't going to give up a large share of the stock. Certainly nothing approaching 50-50 control. Maybe 10%, he suggested. Beatty wasn't so sure. 10% sounded pretty puny. After all, Shearson had put this deal together. The lawyer didn't say much, but he felt certain that Cohen would view the offer as an insult. Equally clear, he could tell, was the fact that Henry Kravis didn't give a damn. While Cohen lunched with Tom Strauss and John Gutfriend of Solomon Brothers and attended a Shearson board meeting, Johnson met with a gaggle of gray-suited commercial bankers at 9 West to raise funds for the Nabisco deal. With their niggling questions about cost cuts, the bankers were a nuisance, and Johnson tried to push them off on Jim Stern of Shearson. In turn, the bankers, led by Bob O'Brien of Bankers Trust, felt Johnson didn't understand the importance of their role. For $13 billion, they thought he ought to sit still for their questions. But Johnson had more important things on his mind, most notably his meeting with Kravis. A few minutes before 4 o'clock, Johnson stepped into the elevator alone for the ride 6 floors down to Kohlberg Kravis. As the elevator doors closed behind him, he realized he had forgotten which floor Kravis was on. He punched 44 and got off there, only to realize his mistake. He tried 42 and wandered around a few minutes before finding the firm in a back corner. Inside, he was ushered into Kravis's corner office and met George Roberts for the first time. The atmosphere was cordial. Johnson had no axe to grind, and Kravis badly wanted Johnson's management expertise. Taking long drags on a premiere, Johnson soon was outlining how he would run a post-LBO RJR Nabisco. The conversation was general. The 3 men wanted to feel one another out. When Kravis and Roberts talked about their operating philosophies, Johnson was impressed. They seemed to know much more about financial structures and money-raising than Cohen's people. Johnson replied with observations about his company, which the cousins, thirsty for information about their prey, listened to intently. Johnson fished for more, openly curious about the possibilities of working with Kohlberg Kravis. "Now, Henry," Johnson said, "if you guys get this, you're not going to get into chicken shit stuff about planes and golf courses, are you?" "That's not important to us," Kravis said. "If you take an extra plane ride, that's up to you." "Talk to Don Kelly," Kravis said. "Well, that's pretty good," Johnson said, nodding. Roberts, however, wasn't as flippant. A man sometimes described as a cold fish, George Roberts was beginning to dislike Johnson's breezy, putting green manners. "Well, we don't want you to live a Spartan life," he said, "but we like to have things justified. We don't mind people using private airplanes to get places if there's no ordinary way. It is important that a CEO set the tone in any deal we do. Check with Peter McGowan." McGowan was chief of the KKR-controlled Safeway stores chain and a friend of Johnson's. "Well, I did," Johnson said. "I guess the deal we're looking for is a bit unusual." Johnson explained that he was looking for a structure in which he would retain significant control of his company. "No," Roberts said, shaking his head. "Kohlberg Kravis didn't operate that way." "We're not going to do any deal where management controls it," Roberts stated. "We'll work with you, but we have no interest in losing control." "Why is that?" Johnson wondered. "We've got the money," Roberts said. "We've got the investors. That's why we have to control the deal." From the look in Johnson's eyes, Roberts could tell it wasn't the message he wanted to hear. "Well, that's interesting," Johnson said. "But frankly, I've got more freedom doing what I do right now." The subject of cost-cutting, one of the keys to a successful LBO, was raised. To Roberts's surprise, Johnson said he didn't care much for wielding a budgetary axe. Anyway, he explained, cutting costs was an overrated procedure. "Any Neanderthal can go in there and whack away and cut costs," he said. "Show me a guy that can spend money." He went on, "I've run as Spartan an operation as anyone, but we're bringing in a first-class management team here. We're not profligate. I don't want a bunch of nerds telling me whether to take a limo or not. That's all chicken shit. What you need to worry about is the price of tobacco or the price of assets I'm selling. I want to deal with the big issues." What was important were things like Premier. Johnson began talking about the smokeless cigarette, its strengths and weaknesses, the status of its test marketing. The secret, he told them, was that it warmed rather than burned the tobacco. Suddenly, Johnson flicked his Premier onto Kravis's antique oriental rug. George Roberts, horrified, looked down at the smoking tube at Johnson's feet. "See? It doesn't burn anything," Johnson said, retrieving it with a grin. He thought Roberts was about to jump out the window. They had been talking about an hour when Johnson trotted out to take a call. He returned a minute later, apologizing. "That was Jimmy and Peter. I'm late to meet with your buddy Ted Forstmann." Johnson smiled. It didn't hurt for these two to know he had options. "Yeah, we know Teddy," Kravis said, smiling in return. "So Forstmann thinks he's going to get in this deal." The information struck Roberts cold. But then everything about Ross Johnson struck Roberts cold. The man didn't seem to be a serious businessman. Now he was going to meet with Ted Forstmann? George Roberts wasn't a man who liked being toyed with. As he left, Johnson brought up the prospect of further talks with Shearson. "I hope you can work things out," he said. "Just be fair, make a fair deal. No one party should be looking to get some great edge over the other party. Work things out, so we can get on with things." When Johnson walked out, a few minutes past 6, Kravis and Roberts agreed. It was time to make their move. Jim Robinson silently cursed cellular phones. After Robinson had emerged from a meeting of the New York City Partnership, a group of top corporate executives working to improve conditions in Gotham, he was surprised to find inside his limousine a phone message from Henry Kravis. As his car pulled away from the curb, the only thing worse than the late afternoon traffic was the reception on Robinson's portable phone. When Kravis came on the line, the transmission came in fits and starts, but his message was crystal clear. "I want to make you an offer," Kravis said. The proposal? Kohlberg Kravis would acquire RJR Nabisco. In return, Shearson would receive a one-time fee of $125 million from Kohlberg Kravis and an option to buy a 10% stake in the company. Kravis said he'd like an answer by midnight. Jim Robinson wasn't the type of man to get excited at the sight of another man's wallet. "Henry, that sounds a little thin," Robinson said, but promised to get back to him. Minutes later, Cohen emerged from the Shearson board meeting to hear the same offer. Cohen said little, but from the tone of his voice, Kravis knew he wasn't being greeted with open arms. Where was Ross Johnson? Ted Forstmann had been waiting for nearly 2 hours, and there was still no sign of the man. After a full day of deliberations, Forstmann was ready to begin his crusade against Kravis and the junk bond scourge. Forstmann Little's computers had chewed through every available piece of public information on RJR Nabisco. Teams of analysts from Goldman Sachs had pored over the resulting printouts, and their conclusions only buttressed what Forstmann already knew. Even at $90 a share, RJR Nabisco was a good deal. Forstmann Little's strategy was clear, at least its first step. Kravis's rash tender offer opened the door for the firm to step in and rescue RJR Nabisco. Kravis was already taking a beating in the press for his franchise speech, and Forstmann's advisors were determined to take advantage of it. "We've got to cloak ourselves in apple pie and motherhood," Jeff Boise told Forstmann, a plan to which he agreed wholeheartedly. Now all they needed was Ross Johnson. Accompanied by Tom Hill, Johnson finally arrived at Forstmann Little at 6:30. After shaking hands, Forstmann noticed a third man behind them. Forstmann took Hill aside. "Who is this fucking guy?" he whispered, motioning to the third man. Hill looked sheepish. "Well, without going into great detail, he travels with Johnson. He has nothing to do with this." A bodyguard, Forstmann thought. Bodyguards were not Forstmann Little's style. It was not a good sign. Forstmann led Hill and Johnson into a conference room whose informal furnishings gave it the atmosphere of a family room rather than a boardroom. 12 black leather chairs ringed a wooden table. A television sat in one corner. The walls were lined with the Depression-era posters Forstmann favored. Johnson, a broad smile pasted across his face, took a seat at the head of the table. "I've just come from the competition," he began. Ted Forstmann flinched. "What?" "I've just come from talking with Kravis." Forstmann couldn't hide his irritation. "What are you doing that for?" Tom Hill intervened. "It's something that we had to do, Ted," he assured Forstmann. "It's nothing, really. I'd attach no importance to it." Johnson was merely covering all his bases, Hill suggested. The mention of Kravis's name set Forstmann off on the spiel. For nearly half an hour, he pontificated on the evils of junk bonds, the sins of Henry Kravis, and the way Forstmann Little could save Wall Street. He made a special point to mention his article in the Wall Street Journal that morning. Johnson listened, secretly amused. "This guy's cock is really stiff over this Wall Street Journal article," he mused. Johnson thought he understood Forstmann's worldview. Henry Kravis is a devil, Ted Forstmann is an angel. His clients are perfect. He's not interested in fees. This guy is doing the Lord's work for people who want to go private. Oh, I see. When Forstmann finished, Nick Forstmann and a partner, Steve Klinsky, began asking Johnson questions about his company. What was the outlook for tobacco? Which businesses could be sold? In his rambling replies, Johnson seemed almost hyperactive. Clearly the pressure of the deal was wearing on him, Forstmann thought. Tom Hill left the room to take a call. It was Cohen, relaying news of Kravis's $125 million offer. "That doesn't sound like my idea of a partnership," Hill said. "Mine either," Cohen agreed. Yet, Hill could see it was attractive. A fee that size was nearly half of Shearson's total merger advisory revenues for the entire 1987 year. Shearson's fourth-quarter earnings were expected to be down, and Hill knew Cohen was under enormous pressure to save them. A one-shot injection of $125 million would be tempting. "Needless to say," Hill said, "if we take it, it would be the end of our merchant banking business. It would be an admission that there's a price where we will stand down. Even if we dressed it up, it would be clear. There's no way we can take it." "That was them again," Hill announced when he returned to the conference room. "We have received the most insulting offer." Forstmann was confused. It was clear Hill meant Kravis. Was Hill negotiating with Kravis on his phone? What was going on here? Lost in his thoughts, Forstmann couldn't have grasped the irony of the poster over his right shoulder. "Don't waste my time," it read. "Idle talk earns nothing." "We have to talk about this," Hill was saying to Johnson, "because this offer isn't as insulting to you as it is to us." Johnson and Hill soon left, leaving the Forstmann brothers perplexed. Was Johnson negotiating with Kravis? If so, why was he talking to Forstmann Little? Maybe they would find out later. Hill had invited Forstmann's crew over to 9 West that evening to talk about joining forces. As they ran through details of the meeting, Steve Klinsky came up to Ted Forstmann. "Are you sure that guy is all there?" he asked. Forstmann put Johnson's strange behavior down to excitement. He had seen the phenomenon many times. a chief executive, secure in his corporate environment, bewildered by the blinding pace of Wall Street. He's under a lot of pressure, Forsman explained. He's in a difficult position, you know. I have sympathy for CEOs in this world. Klinsky wasn't so sure. I think the guy is totally insane. An hour after Kravis lofted his $125 million offer, Dick Beatty was on the phone to Bob Millard at Shearson. Have you heard about our offer? Beatty wondered. Millard passed on the news Beatty expected. Cohen, the trader said, was bouncing off the walls at Kravis's offer. He was insulted. He was outraged. He had never seen anything like it. He's calling it a bribe, Millard said. I knew it, Beatty said with a sigh. Johnson returned to his 48th floor offices to find Cohen in a rage at the Kravis offer. Hill soon joined him. As he stomped about, cursing Kravis, Tom Hill's face turned so red, Johnson thought he was going to have a heart attack. Jim Robinson was also there. For all the sound and fury, the Kravis offer brought into the open the unacknowledged rift between Shearson and Johnson, which had now lasted nearly 2 days since Kravis's announcement the previous morning. Johnson still hadn't openly reaffirmed his commitment to go ahead with the Shearson offer. Robinson and Cohen, although they hadn't pressed the matter, were clearly worried by Johnson's meeting that afternoon with Kravis. Would Johnson stay with Shearson or leap to the Kravis camp? Ross, if you want to go with him, you're perfectly free to do it, Robinson now told Johnson. We won't stop you. Cohen echoed Robinson's sentiments. Oh, hell, Johnson said. Let's just everybody calm down. I've got to talk about this with my people first. Then we'll decide what we're going to do. By nightfall, the 48th floor was overflowing with people. Teams from Shearson, Davis Polk, Jack Nussbaum's law firm, and RJR were all busily reworking weeks of analysis in preparation for topping Kravis's bid. Johnson gathered his executives in his office. Horrigan, Henderson, John Martin, and the others draped themselves over the cream-colored furniture and lined the walls. This is the situation, Johnson said, explaining Kravis's offer. I'm not going to make a unilateral decision here. We're going to vote on it. I'll do what you guys want to do. I want each of you to tell me how you feel. Now you can go any way you want to go, but fellas, you're voting your careers. We can go with Henry, or we can go with Jim. Johnson looked around the room at the men he had chosen to pursue the great adventure. You all know what working for Henry Kravis would be like, he explained. There were nods all around, they knew. But the odds of winning with Shearson were hardly any better, Johnson cautioned. You realize, if we go with Shearson, he said, you're probably all gone. Shearson's chances of beating Kravis seemed that remote. No one was even sure Cohen's people could raise the money necessary to do battle. If they went with Shearson and lost, they'd all lose their jobs. Listening to the speech, Ed Horrigan knew Johnson was serious in encouraging them to reconsider their allegiances. The two men had earlier spoken privately, and when Horrigan asked about Johnson's meeting with Kravis, he had been startled by Johnson's apparent ambivalence. Boy, they're great guys, Johnson had said of Kravis and Roberts. They are? Horrigan said, incredulously. Horrigan had questioned Johnson closely about what had happened 6 floors below. At one level, the feisty tobacco chief was suspicious about what kind of deal Johnson, acting as a free agent, might have cut for himself. At another, he was baffled. How could they suddenly go from regarding Kravis with fear and loathing to embracing the SOB? Maybe hang loose Ross Johnson could make that flip-flop, but not hang tough Ed Horrigan. I don't know what you talked about, Horrigan said, but I don't like it. I don't understand you, Johnson replied. I'm making the biggest deal in the world, and you're not impressed. Horrigan tried to make it simple for him. For one thing, he said, think about how all this will look to the board. How on earth could the management group maintain it was trying to serve shareholder value if it was cutting a deal with Kravis that would no doubt hold down the company's selling price? The board will shove it right up our butt, Horrigan declared. Johnson disagreed. With the $90 floor established by Kravis, shareholder value had already been served. Now, he said, it was important to make sure this bidding contest didn't get out of control, that it didn't get to the point where the debt they piled on would make it impossible to run the company. Horrigan didn't want to hear any more about consorting with Kravis. They're the enemy, he had said. I don't see how we can work with them. Now, as they went around the room one by one, Horrigan again decried Kravis and his methods. Staying with Shearson was the right thing to do, no matter what the chances of victory. You go home with the guy who brung you, Horrigan said. We win with Shearson, or we go out with Shearson. The others, Henderson, Ed Robinson, Sage, agreed. Look, we're in. We're with you, John Martin said. We picked our partners, and we'll stay with them. The crisis had passed. When the group adjourned, Johnson summoned Cohen. I know you had some doubts about us, he said. You made a very generous offer to free us up. I appreciate that. I just want to reaffirm that we're with you. Cohen was clearly gratified. I appreciate the vote of confidence. Let me tell you, we'll stick with you to the end. At the height of the evening's chaos, Ted Forstmann arrived on the 48th floor. The moment he emerged from the elevator, Forstmann had a bad feeling. The place was crawling with people. Most of them seemed to be lawyers. Forstmann groaned. Too many cooks. Forstmann had brought along his brother Nick, his lawyer, Steve Frayden, and Jeff Boise of Goldman Sachs. They too noticed the disorder. Boise, accustomed to dealing with investment bankers, was puzzled to see senior executives such as Cohen and Robinson darting about. Who's in charge here? He wondered. The Forstmann group was escorted into a windowless conference room dominated by a single cherry table and packed with more than a dozen lawyers and investment bankers. Johnson was there, as was Cohen. Immediately, the Shearson troops began pelting Forstmann with questions, most of them variations on a single theme. How do you fight Henry Kravis? Forstmann brushed the questions aside. There was no sense in talking about that, he explained, until they were sure they were on the same wavelength. For at least the second time that day, Forstmann launched into the spiel. First came the denunciations of Kravis. No junk bonds, no bridge loans. Forstmann was gathering steam when he noticed Johnson duck out. No hostile tender offers, he continued. None of that crazy shit. On and on he went. After a bit, Cohen followed Johnson out the door. I don't fuck around, Forstmann concluded. We don't say yes to many things, but we're there on this one. Are you there? Forstmann looked around. Suddenly it struck him that the conference room had emptied. Only 3 of the original group remained. As Forstmann scratched his head, a junior Shearson banker began suggesting ways that junk bonds could be wedded to Forstmann Little's goals without sullying the firm's moral views. Forstmann was annoyed. Hadn't this guy heard anything he'd said? Hadn't he bothered to read the article in the Wall Street Journal that very morning? Didn't he know who he was talking to? Wait, Forstmann said in exasperation. You guys don't understand. I don't do that stuff. Then, distracted, he paused. Where did everybody go? He asked. No one knew. When the remaining Shearson bankers left, Forstmann wasn't sure what to do. He waited. For more than an hour there was no sign of Johnson, Cohen, Jim Robinson, or Tom Hill. Jeff Boise began to get mad. Something funny's going on here, he warned. All evening, Cohen had been trying to reach Kravis. It was important, he and Johnson agreed, to send a message back to him that his $125 million bribe was entirely unsatisfactory. John Martin suggested a dead fish might get the idea across. Cohen left messages at Kravis's apartment. He called Dick Beatty. Did Beatty know where Kravis was? The lawyer knew, but he wasn't telling Cohen. As they spoke, Kravis was in fact enjoying a lavish black-tie dinner at a nearby restaurant, La Grenouille, given by the agent Swifty Lazar for Henry Kissinger. There, he chatted with Felix Roeden, the Lazard banker now working with Charlie Hugel's special committee, and with Solomon's John Goodfriend. The room, of course, was abuzz with gossip on the RJR Nabisco deal. Goodfriend sat at Kravis's table, smiling to himself as his tablemates quizzed the diminutive financier. Not once did Goodfriend let on that Solomon was on the verge of joining the battle against Kravis. His dinner chatter with Kravis was limited to a comment about Kravis's newfound press exposure. "I think," Goodfriend said, "this is the first time I remember a financial guy has been on the front page of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times in the same day." Henry Kravis smiled. He didn't much like John Goodfriend. After dinner, Kravis returned to his apartment and waited for Cohen's call. From his library window, he could see the 48th floor of 9 West ablaze with light. "They're still up there," he thought. At 12:15, the phone rang. It was Johnson. Johnson's normally ebullient air was gone. "Henry, I'm disappointed in you," he said. "That's a lousy offer you made to them. I thought you were going to be fair. That wasn't fair at all. That's not right." There was still room for a dialogue, Johnson explained, but not on those terms. If Kravis had something better to propose, he was still welcome to do so. Kravis wasn't surprised. Beatty's intelligence, as always, had been on target. "Fine," Kravis said. He was in no mood for a debate. "If that's the way you feel." Johnson put down the phone and looked at Goldstone. The two men were seated in the anteroom just off Johnson's office. Cohen hovered outside the door. Goldstone wasn't pleased with his client's performance. Johnson's personality simply wasn't built for confrontations. The guy was too cheerful for his own good. "Ross, look, if you're intending to give the message to Henry that you're not going to switch sides here, you didn't give him that message," the lawyer said. "I think you should call him again and give him the message more clearly." "Maybe I didn't make it clear enough." "I think that's right," Goldstone said. "It sounded kind of vague." "Maybe I ought to call him back." "Yeah, I think you ought to." 5 minutes later, Johnson phoned Kravis again. "Henry, maybe I didn't make one thing clear. Let me tell you, I'm staying with Shearson. I don't want you to think in any way we're not partners. You can't expect me to abandon the people that are my partners." Kravis wondered why Johnson was calling a second time. Someone was pulling Johnson's strings, he decided. He wondered who was really in charge of the management group. "I wouldn't expect you to," Kravis said. "Ross, let me make one thing clear. Nobody's given a thought to splitting you two. That's not what we're about." It was a lie, more or less. But this was no time to alienate Ross Johnson. Kravis hung up, worried, and quickly conferred with George Roberts and Dick Beatty. Rejection of their offer was not good at all. A $90 a share tender offer looked fine in the papers, but Kravis was acutely aware that he had never made a major takeover bid without the analytical help of a management team that knew its company inside and out. He didn't like to admit it, but one thing was clear. He needed Ross Johnson. Besides, a bidding war at these levels could cost the winner billions of dollars. Kravis and Roberts agreed a second approach was called for. Kravis dialed Johnson at 9 West. After a minute, Cohen came on the line. "Peter, I think it's probably good for us to talk," Kravis said. "You know we're not trying to split you up. I just think we should talk about this." "Fine," Cohen said. "Let's talk." "Why don't we meet in the morning?" "No, if you want to meet, let's meet right now." Cohen didn't mention that he had Ted Forstmann cooling his heels in a back room. "Peter, it's 12:30 at night." "No, if you have something to say it now. Tomorrow might be too late." Kravis called Dick Beatty minutes later. "They want to meet." "What time tomorrow?" Beatty was ready for bed. "Tonight." "Tonight?" Beatty pulled on a light jacket, walked out of his Fifth Avenue apartment, and hailed a cab. On the way, he picked up Roberts at the Carlisle Hotel, then Kravis at his Park Avenue apartment. The cab made good time, moving through the empty streets. When the trio pulled up outside 9 West, they were surprised to find a long line of limousines parked outside. Kravis shook his head. "Geez," he said, "the whole world must be upstairs." George Scheinberg, the Shearson vice chairman, saw Kravis come off the elevator a few minutes past 1 o'clock. An accomplished photographer, Scheinberg had brought along a camera. He started to raise the camera to snap a picture. This was history in the making, but stopped. Normally not a superstitious man, Scheinberg didn't want to jinx the meeting. Shearson's Jim Stern waved as Kravis, Roberts, and Beatty emerged from the elevator. Stern had spent much of the evening updating a team of Solomon investment bankers in a conference room just 8 feet from the one where the Forstmans sat. A pair of locked doors was the best bet the two groups wouldn't run into each other. Hurrying back to the Solomon people, Stern couldn't help thinking what a 3-ring circus the evening was turning into. The air was electric inside Johnson's office as the Shearson group awaited Kravis's arrival. Cohen and a half-dozen others, including Jim Robinson and Tom Hill, paced the room nervously. Among other things, Shearson's chief was deathly afraid Kravis would somehow run into Ted Forstman. God only knew what would happen then. Johnson's office was, literally and figuratively, a smoke-filled room. A cigarillo hung from Johnson's lower lip, and Cohen puffed one of his ever-present cigars. A layer of smoke hung low in the stale air. No one seemed to mind. This was, after all, a cigarette company they were trying to buy. On a shelf behind Johnson's desk was a copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War. There was no evidence Johnson had ever read it. Windows ran the length of one wall. Outside, the view looked south past the darkened RCA building and the red neon letters of Payne Weber to the twinkling lights of Lower Manhattan beyond. Kravis, Roberts, and Beatty were escorted into the executive suite, past Andy Sage's empty office and rows of burl-paneled cabinets, and into Johnson's office. Pleasantries took several minutes in the crowded room. Jack Nussbaum ribbed Beatty, who looked as if he had thrown on a jacket over his pajamas. "Dick, you look like you just tucked in for the night." The smoky air immediately bothered George Roberts, who instinctively began waving the haze from his face. His eyes stinging, Roberts attempted to make light of his discomfort. "I'm glad you guys don't make cigars," he said as he met Ed Horrigan. "Cigar smoke drives me nuts." It took a moment for the irony of Roberts's remark to register. Johnson and Horrigan exchanged astonished looks. Did he say smoke bothered him? It seemed an incredible admission from a man looking to buy one of America's great cigarette companies. Roberts's faux pas set the tone for what would be a bewildering evening for all concerned. "If it really bothers you," Cohen said, motioning to his lit cigar, "I'll put it out." "Yes, it does," Roberts said. "This is fucking beautiful," Horrigan muttered. Cohen left the room, returning seconds later with an unlit cigar. Holding it in his hand, he moved behind Johnson's empty desk. Earlier, Cohen and Jim Robinson had agreed that it would be best if the American Express chief made himself scarce when Kravis arrived. Cohen knew the Robinsons and Kravises were horseback riding buddies, and he didn't want Robinson's judgment blurred in a confrontation with his friend. Now, Robinson and Johnson rose to make their exit. "We're going to let you banker types talk," Johnson told the group. "I hope you guys can put something together. It'll be better for everybody. We'll be down the hall if you need us." "Let's all keep in mind that a lot of people are watching this process, including Congress," Robinson said. "We wouldn't want to hurt the business that we've grown to love and admire," George Roberts said wryly. As Robinson and Johnson left, Cohen instinctively knew how he and Hill would handle their opponents. It was the same in every Wall Street negotiation, he felt. The senior partner tended to play the statesman's role, the good cop, while the junior partner inevitably played the enforcer, the bad cop. For years, Cohen had played Sandy Weil's bad cop, a role he played so well it became second nature. Tonight, Cohen would try out his new role as diplomat. Still angry about Kravis's bribe, he started out poorly. Standing behind Johnson's desk, Cohen emphasized that Shearson remained open-minded to a partnership with Kohlberg Kravis, but although his tone was even, Cohen's combative instincts soon took over. "This is our deal," he said. "We're not going to go away. We're not going to take a subsidiary role to you or anyone else. We've got Ross on our side, and that gives us an obvious advantage." As for Kohlberg Kravis's offer, Cohen went on, "We're not interested in taking any bribes. You couldn't pay us twice what you've offered. It's insulting, and it's arrogant." Later, Cohen himself would acknowledge, "No one's ever going to confuse me with a statesman." George Roberts, sitting on the couch beside Beatty, spoke coolly, his hands never leaving his lap. "Peter, we've come here to talk about this in a business-like manner. Why don't you give us some idea of a way we can work together? We'd like to explore these possibilities, see what we can work out." But Shearson wasn't done yet. Tom Hill, cool, well-tailored, clearly unintimidated, weighed in as the bad cop. "Management has now made the decision to stay with Shearson Lehman," he began. "We are now entering a realm where, absent a deal between us, we will be competing." Hill wanted to make clear the risks facing Kravis in an all-out fight. "Henry, you're entering uncharted territory. This is unique. You don't have management on your side. That raises a whole host of questions, chiefly your ability to get at the right numbers." Now Hill bore in. "This all raises the question of how you will be perceived, friendly or hostile. This is a hostile bid, and your investors will have reservations about this deal. It also has real implications for how future managements will want to deal with you. In addition, as you know, RJR has its operations in the South and in the Carolinas. These are constituencies where there are some very strong legislators, including Jesse Helms. I'm sure Jesse Helms would take a very active interest in the future of this company and its community." The threats were unmistakable. When Hill paused, everyone spoke at once. Kravis was infuriated. "Tom," he said, "if that's a threat, that's ridiculous. I'm not going to sit here and listen to you threaten us." "If you want to call Jesse Helms, Tom, go ahead, be our guest," Roberts said. "It's a free country." Dick Beatty, palms outstretched, tried to head things off. "Tom, that's not going to get us anywhere." Cohen interrupted before anyone built up a head of steam. Hey, this is ridiculous," he said. "This is not what this meeting is about. We're here to see how we can go in together." Beatty, glad for Cohen's olive branch, didn't miss the fact that the Shearson chief had waited until Hill finished to intervene. It was past 2:00 when a messenger stuck his head into the conference room where the Forstmans sat waiting. Ross Johnson wanted to see them. "Should I bring Frayden?" Forstman asked. "No," the man said. "No lawyers." Wearily, Ted Forstman and his brother Nick pulled themselves from their seats and followed their guide past darkened rooms into Ed Horrigan's corner office. Inside sat Johnson, Jim Robinson, and Horrigan. Robinson wore a rumpled tuxedo with the tie pulled down. "What's going on?" Forstman asked. Jim Robinson spoke. "Ted, I want you to know what's going on. There's no other way to tell you but the truth." "What's that?" "Our side is meeting with Henry Kravis in another conference room." Forstman stared at a spot somewhere above Robinson's head. It was as if someone had sucked him in the stomach. For a moment, Forstman searched for words. He took a seat on a couch beside his brother. Disappointment wasn't a strong enough word for Forstman's feelings at the moment. It bordered on betrayal. He had so hoped these people had principles. He had wanted so badly to believe they could see through Kravis as he had. Now, he realized, he had been wrong. Slowly, a stream of profanity, like some earthy ticker tape, began scrolling through Forstman's mind. "Son of a bitch," he thought. "Son of a fucking bitch, what did I ever come here for? Of all people, they're talking to that little bastard Kravis." Forstman said nothing. Robinson continued. "Teddy, what we've done is the best thing, not the right thing. It's the smart business thing to do." Forstman remained silent. "We don't think it's going anywhere," Robinson said. Johnson piped up. "No, we don't think it will. It's not going to go anywhere. Management is not going to go with these guys." Forstmann thought. Then why are you down there talking with them? Oh, how he hated to hear the lies. He wanted to shout, "You bastards!" but held his tongue. He had always told his partners that once you lose your temper, you lose the deal. He looked at Jim Robinson. "Well, it's none of my business," Forstmann said, "but I really don't agree with you." He wanted to leave it at that, but knew he couldn't. "I think that they're really third-rate people," he ventured. "They've proven themselves over and over again to be third-rate people." Again, Forstmann looked at Jim Robinson with imploring eyes. It was an awkward moment. "We're friends, socially, Ted," Robinson said. "We only know them socially." He paused. "Anyway, there's nothing to really worry about because it's not going to work out." "Jim," Forstmann said, "whether it works out or not, why are you doing this? I just don't get it. I mean, how can you do business with these guys when you have us? Our money costs 9%. You don't need junk bonds. You don't need Kravis. I would never have done what they did. I would never have lobbed in $90. If KKR hadn't come along, we would have just cheered you on from the sidelines." They talked for a while longer, awkwardly passing the minutes talking about tennis and golf. "Well," Forstmann finally said, "thank you for at least telling me." "Yeah," Johnson said. "You gotta give us some credit for at least telling you." "Yeah," Forstmann said. "Thanks." Forstmann returned to Boise and Freyden, a defeated man. "You guys are never going to believe this," he began. "Let's go," Freyden said when Forstmann relayed the news. "There was no reason to stay and try to work with people who treated you like this," the lawyer said. "Forstmann would never pull such a stunt," Freyden added, "and he shouldn't work with people who did." "I don't want you around here," the lawyer told him. Freyden sounded like a kindly uncle after a playground fight. But after 8 years, he had developed a strangely protective attitude toward Teddy Forstmann. In many ways, his client was naive about Wall Street, Freyden knew. He didn't run with people like Cohen and Kravis, and as much as he criticized them, deep down, he didn't really understand them. Forstmann trusted people to be as upfront as he was, and that sometimes led to rude surprises, like tonight. "Let's get the fuck out of here," Forstmann agreed, and made to leave. Jeff Boise stopped him. "Hold it, Ted. Eventually, we all want to get out of here, but this is a situation that could turn to our advantage. That is, if you'll stay." The Goldman banker had taken note of the chaotic atmosphere, the bewildered faces, the confusing presence of top executives such as Cohen and Robinson. He saw an opportunity in the air of desperation he sensed about the Shearson team. "These guys are floundering," Boise suggested to Forstmann. "If they can't work out something with KKR, they're really going to need us. We could dictate our own terms." Forstmann was torn. He badly wanted to fight Kravis and show the world the truth about junk bonds. But Johnson didn't seem to be able to tell the difference between right and wrong, between Forstmann Little and Kohlberg Kravis, and that bothered him. They waited. Across the 48th floor, talks in Johnson's smoke-filled office were going nowhere. In theory, it was in both sides' interest to negotiate some form of partnership. Everyone had too much to lose in a long public fight. But partnership clearly meant different things to different people. Cohen rejected Kravis's offer of a 10% equity stake as an insult. Kravis wanted no part of a 50-50 split. "We've never done that before," Kravis said, "and we're not starting now." "Well, there's always a first," Tom Hill said. "I mean, how many $20 billion deals come around? There's plenty for all of us." Kravis, still seething at Hill's invocation of Jesse Helms, glared at the banker. "We're not going to do a deal where we give up control. We just can't do that. That's the way it works." For an hour, they swerved from issue to issue, never finding agreement, never mushrooming into outright confrontation. "Well," Kravis said to Cohen, "what role do you see for yourselves?" "We'll do the financing. We'll do the whole deal." Kravis rolled his eyes. "Why don't you just let us do the deal? You guys can come in as equity partners. What do you care? You'll get your fair share of fees. At one point, Kravis and Roberts asked again about Shearson's deal with Johnson. There's no sense talking about the management deal until we can work out our deal, Cohen said. How can we cut our deal without knowing your deal? Roberts shot back. Cohen outlined the deal in the vaguest terms. They were getting nowhere. George Roberts attempted a Solomonic compromise. The Shearson Group could acquire RJR Nabisco outright, he suggested, then agree to sell Kohlberg Kravis its food businesses. It was a complex proposal involving a maze of tax benefits that took a few minutes to explain. Roberts asked Tom Hill how much Shearson would want for RJR's food businesses. Oh, 15 and a half, he said. $15.5 billion. Well, Roberts said, we have a problem right there. That business isn't worth more than $14 billion. Cohen and Hill left the room and caucused a few minutes before rejecting the idea out of hand. And so it went. There was no shortage of matters to disagree on. The question arose, for instance, which investment bank would supervise the post-takeover bond offerings. Besides the return on an LBO investment, running the books or leading those offerings was the plum assignment for an investment bank in an RJR Nabisco buyout. Kravis saw Drexel, the firm that had created and long dominated the junk market, as the natural choice. We're not going to take a back seat to Drexel, Cohen said. That's not even negotiable. Not to mention the fact that Drexel was about to be indicted. Who knows what could happen to them then, he said. By 3 o'clock, it was obvious that no agreement would be reached. As Kravis and Roberts rose to leave, Cohen took Dick Beatty aside. Look, Cohen said, to the extent you have any influence here, we should get together before this gets too crazy. This could get really out of hand. Downstairs, Kravis and Roberts hailed a cab. As it pulled away from the curb, Henry Kravis's only thoughts were on strangling Tom Hill. The Jesse Helms remark still incensed him, and no amount of Dick Beatty's soothing words could calm Kravis down. Can you believe that guy? Threatening us? Kravis said. George Roberts thought Hill was simply one of the worst of a bad breed. Knowing Tom Hill, he said, you could almost have scripted what he was going to say. Ross Johnson expected to return to his office and find the situation with Kravis diffused. He was shocked to find the talks had fallen through. Cohen was pacing about, uttering foul things about Kravis. It's absolutely impossible, he told Johnson. We can't do business with them. Johnson couldn't believe it. In 4 separate conversations now, Cohen hadn't been able to reach some kind of compromise with Kravis. What was going on here? A man who prided himself on getting along with anyone, Johnson couldn't fathom why Cohen was unable to strike a deal, especially at a time when it seemed so vital. Kravis and Cohen were like inert chemicals that exploded when mixed. Having met with him that afternoon, Johnson knew Kravis wasn't that difficult to deal with. Johnson listened as Cohen railed about how unreasonable Kravis had been. From the tone of his voice, Johnson suspected Cohen was almost glad the talks had gone nowhere. It gave him an excuse to stiff-arm Kravis and keep the deal for Shearson. Johnson, more worried about his company than Wall Street rivalries, began to have serious doubts about Cohen's brand of machismo. Jesus, he thought, something is really wrong here. Johnson's reverie was interrupted when someone stuck his head into the room and said Ted Forstmann was about to leave. Oh my God, Jim Robinson said. Teddy's still down there. As Cohen and the others hustled out to head off Forstmann, Johnson and Robinson remained behind. I feel like keepers of the asylum, Johnson said. Jeff Boise hadn't been able to stand the waiting a minute longer. Forstmann's combative investment banker got up from his chair and left the windowless conference room like a man on a mission. Outside, no one was in sight. He checked a number of deserted offices before he found what he was looking for. Inside an office, a pair of Shearson executives, Jeff Lane and George Scheinberg, sat on a desk talking. Boise stuck his head in the door. I just want to tell you guys one thing. I've been in this business 18 years, and this is the most atrocious behavior I've ever seen. It's simply outrageous. We will not be treated this way. I simply won't stand for it anymore." With that, Boise stormed out. Ted Forstmann had had enough. He and his trio of advisors picked up their coats and began to look for someone to whom to say goodbye. Suddenly, down a long corridor, Forstmann saw Cohen and a retinue of a half-dozen people trotting toward him. The two groups came face to face outside the conference room where Forstmann had been cooling his heels for most of the evening. "Hey, partner," Cohen said, extending his arms in welcome toward Forstmann. "Let's go. Let's talk." Forstmann realized instantly what had happened. The talks with Kravis had fallen through, and Cohen now needed Forstmann little. For the second time that night, Forstmann wanted to scream. He looked at Cohen and knew exactly what he wanted to say. "You make me sick." But Forstmann couldn't leave. It was, he would later reflect, a moment quite similar to ones he had experienced in high school romances. With every girl, there was a moment before you broke up, when you just knew, that if you left her right then, you would never make up. Forstmann knew if he left RJR Nabisco's offices at that moment, he would never return. Henry Kravis would gain the biggest prize in history as a result. And nobody would know the truth. Nobody would know the Emperor had no clothes. The two groups filed back into the conference room. Inside, Forstmann tried to keep calm, but as usual did a poor job of it. Before they went any further, before they could even consider being partners, he had to make Cohen understand what Forstmann Little was about. He had to make them understand the fundamental differences between Forstmann Little and Kohlberg Kravis. "You can't mention Forstmann Little and Kohlberg Kravis in the same breath," Forstmann said. "We are not comparable. When I started this business 10 years ago, I said I wanted to be the best. I didn't care about being the biggest. If you think the biggest is the best, go away. You belong with Kravis. Our returns are 3 and 4 times the returns they lie about getting." Jim Robinson cut him off before he got too far into the spiel. "We know all that, Ted. We know that's true. That's why we're all here." A few minutes later, Ross Johnson joined the gathering. Forstmann turned to him. "What I'm saying is, if you have any ambivalence about KKR, you can't be for me. You just can't." It had to be all or nothing, Forstmann said. He wouldn't be partners with anyone who would even consider joining forces with Kravis. Jeff Boise thought he knew what was needed. "We need to hear you guys say that if we're going to go forward, you will not deal with these people anymore." He repeated the same message 2 or 3 times so it would sink in. Boise looked at Johnson, who slouched down in his chair, his head in his right hand just inches above the tabletop. He appeared exhausted. From time to time, Johnson sipped from a glass of clear liquid. Steve Fraden, who noticed Johnson seemed to be slurring his words, wondered whether the glass held water or vodka. "Ross," Boise continued, "I think what Teddy's saying is he wants to be sure you're through with Kravis. I think he wants you to look him in the eye and tell him you've made up your mind. Tell him you're finished with this other business. If you're not, we'll leave right now." Forstmann interrupted. "Is it over? 'Cause if it isn't over, we're over." Finally, Johnson spoke. "There's no deal with those guys. That was something we had to do. It had to be done. And now we're finished. We need your help. We'd like to work with you." There was some more talk about strategy and tactics and how best to deal with a hostile Henry Kravis. And then somebody said it was 4 a.m, and didn't everyone have plenty of work tomorrow? Soon they rose and shook hands and headed for the elevators. As they did, Ted Forstmann couldn't help thinking that no one had apologized for letting him sit in a room alone for more than 3 hours. The cool morning breeze blew hard against their faces as the Forstmann group emerged from 9 West. For a few moments, the 4 men stood in silence on 57th Street, each lost in his own thoughts. Boise broke the silence. "Are you sure you want to do something with these guys?" he asked Forstmann. "Jeff," Forstmann said, "it's where the management is. It's where we should start. We need to at least try to work with them, don't you agree?" "Speaking as an advisor, and I'm an advisor now," Boise said, I have a thought. I want you to tell them that you're upset. I mean it. We need to tell them we didn't like what happened in there." It was clear where Boise stood. He wanted nothing to do with Peter Cohen. But then Boise had his own agenda. Several of Goldman's best clients, including Procter & Gamble, were chomping at the bit to get a piece of this deal. "Teddy, don't you feel you have an alternative?" Boise wondered. "I mean, why don't you do something with us? With Goldman Sachs?" "Jeff," Forsman said, "I have 3 alternatives. I can join up with these guys. I can go team up with you. That's certainly doable. Or I could do nothing." Frayden laughed, as if to say the idea of doing nothing in Wall Street's fee-driven atmosphere was something only Ted Forsman could imagine. "Jeff, you do take me seriously, don't you?" Forsman said. "About doing nothing? I mean, if there's nothing there, I won't do anything." "I think you ought to tell Cohen that," Boise said. "That's the type of thing an advisor should do," Forsman replied. "I want as little as possible to do with this Cohen guy." Chapter 11. The peace talks off, Cohen's troops prepared for war. With Kravis forging ahead with his $90 tender offer, every assumption underlying the management group's $75 bid had to be thrown out. A small mountain of revised analysis was already underway. New divestiture estimates were calculated, and talks aimed at securing $15 billion from the bank group were restarted. In the spirit of men bailing out a sinking ship, the gnomes at Shearson quietly tossed each of Johnson's corporate playthings overboard to make possible a higher bid. All the planes, the penthouses, Premier, the country clubs, the Atlanta headquarters, recalls Tom Hill, had to be napalmed. Not only had Shearson been badly outmaneuvered, it now found itself outmatched by the financial sophistication of Kohlberg Kravis and its advisors, Drexel and Merrill Lynch.